Lars Andersen sent 16 Norwegian resistance fighters to kill Bumpy Johnson. Only 4 walked out, and the message they delivered made the most feared Norwegian commander in New York abandon his empire and flee to Oslo forever. December 13th, 1946. Bumpy Johnson was outnumbered, 16-1. Lars Andersen had sent his deadliest crew, Erik the Shadow, Astrid the Wolf, Magnus the Silent, Ingrid the Ghost, 12 more SOE veterans, whose names were whispered in fear from Trondheim to Brooklyn. They cornered Bumpy in the Savoy ballroom basement. No witnesses, no way out. Bumpy was 41 years old, king of Harlem, but facing battle-hardened resistance fighters. Andersen was the most connected Norwegian commander in New York. Everyone expected the same ending: Bumpy Johnson dead in a basement. But what Andersen didn't know, Bumpy Johnson understood liberation better than most Norwegians. 3 hours later, only 4 of those 16 fighters walked out alive, and they delivered a message that made Lars Andersen abandon his territory and disappear forever. This is the story of the night. Bumpy Johnson reminded Norwegian fighters what they really fought for. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand Lars Andersen. He was a former SOE operative who'd fought against the Nazis during World War II, conducting sabotage operations in occupied Norway. When the war ended, Andersen came to New York with dozens of other Norwegian resistance veterans, men who'd lived in darkness for 5 years. By 1946, Andersen controlled the Brooklyn Norwegian community with military precision. His fighters weren't typical gangsters. They were saboteurs who'd survived Nazi occupation, who'd blown up bridges and railways with nothing but explosives and courage. Men and women who understood sacrifice, stealth, and absolute loyalty to their cause. But there was a problem: Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy had been expanding his operations into Brooklyn since 1945, establishing protection services for Norwegian businesses, helping Norwegian immigrants navigate American bureaucracy, offering security from anti-immigrant violence. To Andersen, this wasn't business cooperation. This was invasion. A black American protecting Norwegians was insulting to everything the resistance had fought for. February 1946. Andersen sent emissaries to Bumpy. The message was clear: stay out of Brooklyn or face the consequences of crossing Norwegian resistance veterans. Bumpy sent back a response that made Andersen's blood boil. Tell Lars that darkness fighters don't threaten other darkness fighters. March 1946. Andersen tried intimidation. He convinced Norwegian shop owners to refuse service to Bumpy's people. He pressured Norwegian dock workers to delay shipments to businesses under Bumpy's protection. He spread rumors that Bumpy was working with federal agents. Bumpy responded by opening a winter aid program for Norwegian families: free heating assistance, job placement, and protection from ethnic discrimination, in the heart of Bay Ridge. April 1946. Andersen escalated. He sent 8 fighters to destroy the aid program office. They came back unconscious, tied up, and left at a Lutheran church with a note: real resistance fighters protect immigrants. They don't abandon them. By December 1946, Andersen was getting pressure from other SOE veterans. His inability to control the Harlem problem was making Norwegian resistance fighters look weak. SOE veterans didn't tolerate weakness. So Andersen made a decision that would end his leadership. He assembled 16 of his most battle-tested veterans, men and women who'd survived Nazi occupation, who'd fought Wehrmacht troops in the frozen forests, who'd killed fascists, and would kill for Norwegian honor. The plan was simple: corner Bumpy Johnson on St. Lucia Day. Execute him brutally. Send a message that protecting Norwegians was Norwegian business only. December 12, 1946. The 16 fighters gathered at Andersen's warehouse in Red Hook. These weren't street criminals. Edrek had destroyed 12 Nazi supply trains with explosives. Astrid had led nighttime raids against German patrol posts. Ingrid had survived Gestapo interrogation without breaking. They were heroes who'd lost their way. Andersen briefed them personally. Bumpy Johnson has insulted Norwegian honor for the last time. He must be eliminated completely. What are his crimes against Norway? Asked Magnus the Silent. He protects our people without authorization. He makes Norwegians dependent on Black American assistance. He undermines our community's independence. The fighters accepted their mission. They'd been following Andersen since arriving in America. They trusted his leadership completely. December 13th, 1946, 10:45 p.m. St. Lucia Day, Festival of Light. But light would be tested in Harlem. 16 Norwegian fighters moved through Manhattan like ghosts. They disabled security, cut communications, positioned themselves with military precision around the Savoy Ballroom. Erik picked the lock using skills, learned breaking into German installations. The 16 fighters descended the stairs in perfect silence. Professional resistance veterans executing a military operation. They found Bumpy sitting alone, reading a Norwegian newspaper, drinking aquavit. He looked up as they formed a semicircle around him. 16 weapons pointed at his head. Lars Andersen sends his regards, Erik announced, his Norwegian accent thick with authority. Bumpy folded his newspaper slowly. He looked around the semicircle of fighters, studying their faces carefully. Then he spoke in perfect Norwegian. "Sexton Krieger for Audreppen man," Bumpy said. 16 warriors to kill one man. The fighters froze. Bumpy Johnson speaking Norwegian was impossible. But what he said next changed everything. Date, Eva Nordahl Grieg, vil ha henskit," Bumpy continued. "Is this what Nordahl Grieg would have wanted?" Erik lowered his weapon slightly. "How do you know about Grieg?" "Jeg kjenner historien om norske motstand," Bumpy replied. "I know the history of Norwegian resistance, because I understand fighting in darkness against impossible odds." Astrid stepped forward. "You dare speak our poet's name." "I speak about resistance because I am a resistance fighter," Bumpy said, standing slowly. "You fought the Nazis to liberate Norway. I fight oppression to protect my community. We're both darkness fighters." Ingrid was confused. "But you're interfering with Norwegian community affairs." "I'm protecting Norwegian immigrants from the same forces that occupied your homeland," Bumpy corrected. "The same people who collaborated with the Nazis are the ones pressuring your businesses now." Hoppy reached into his jacket, 16 weapons aimed at him, but he moved slowly, carefully. He pulled out a small object and placed it on the table. It was a Norwegian resistance armband, red, white, and blue, with the words for Norge og Frihet. "A friend gave me this in Alcatraz," Bumpy said quietly. Norwegian resistance fighter named Knut Hokelid fought with SOE against the Germans, died in prison defending his principles. Erik stared at the armband. "Knut Hokelid. You knew him?" "He was my demolitions instructor. Taught me everything about fighting in darkness." "He taught me something too," Bumpy said. "He taught me that resistance fighters protect all people living in darkness, not just their own." The basement went completely silent. 16 Norwegian veterans suddenly questioning everything they thought they knew. "What are you saying?" Astrid asked. "I'm saying Lars Andersen isn't fighting for Norwegian liberation. He's fighting to control Norwegians the same way the Germans controlled them." Magnus spoke for the first time in months. "But Andersen led us to freedom." "Andersen led you away from your principles," Bumpy replied. "You're not fighting for Norwegian freedom anymore. You're fighting to keep Norwegians isolated and vulnerable." Ingrid looked around at her comrades. Professional fighters, but also Norwegians raised on stories of resistance and liberation in darkness. "What proof do you have?" Ingrid asked. Bumpy gestured to the resistance armband. "Look at what's sewn beneath the Norwegian flag." Erik examined the armband carefully. Sewn in small letters were the words "For alle som lever i mørket," for all who live in darkness. Knut believed that Norwegian freedom meant freedom for everyone living under oppression. Bumpy continued. "Not just freedom for Norway, but freedom from darkness everywhere." For the next 2 hours, 16 Norwegian fighters listened as Bumpy explained how oppression had followed them to America, how controlling their community was the same as occupation, how fighting other oppressed peoples only help their common enemy. He's right, Astrid said quietly. We've become what we fought against in Norway. Erik studied the resistance armband. What do you propose we do? Take this armband back to Andersen. Tell him it came from Nordahl Grieg's student. Tell him that Norwegian resistance fighters don't abandon people living in darkness. One by one, the 16 fighters filed back up the basement stairs, but not all of them. 12 men and women left the Savoy ballroom that night. Why? Bumpy asked. Because you reminded us what we liberated Norway for, Erik replied. The next morning, Erik the Shadow walked into Andersen's warehouse and placed the Norwegian resistance armband on his table. Where is Bumpy Johnson? Andersen demanded. Alive. What do you mean, alive? I sent 16 fighters. Erik's voice carried the authority of the Norwegian forests. You sent 16 freedom fighters to abandon another community in darkness. We remembered what we really stand for. Andersen stood up, his face red with rage. How dare you question my leadership? How dare you betray the resistance? Erik replied. Bumpy Johnson understands Norwegian liberation better than you do. The room went dead silent. Andersen's other associates watched as Erik delivered the message that would end their leader's control. Nordahl Grieg died fighting for everyone living in darkness. You've become someone who creates darkness. We won't be part of it. And if I report this to the other SOE commanders? Erik looked around the room at Andersen's remaining supporters. Men and women who'd heard about the resistance armband, who understood what it meant. Then you'll discover that some Norwegian fighters remember what we really liberated Norway from. 3 days later, Lars Andersen boarded a ship to Bergen. He never returned to New York. The 4 fighters who stayed behind became trusted allies in Bumpy's organization. They helped establish Norwegian immigrant assistance programs, anti-discrimination networks, and winter aid services. And that Norwegian resistance armband, Bumpy kept it in his office for the rest of his life. A reminder that liberation recognizes no borders, and resistance fighters protect all people living in darkness. December 13th, 1946. 16 fighters walked into a basement to preserve Norwegian isolation. 12 walked out, having remembered what liberation means, and the 4 who stayed proved that Norwegian courage meant fighting darkness, not creating it. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy. It's showing them they're betraying everything they once fought for. If this story of liberation transcending borders moved you, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you believe resistance fighters protect all oppressed peoples, and comment below, what would you have done in that basement?